Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me this afternoon for this Studies of Religion HSC Masterclass on Judaism Bioethics. My name's Elizabeth Alderton, and my current role is Specialist Accreditation at the Sydney Catholic Schools Central Office. Most of my work these days is done with teachers. But since the very instigation of the Studies of Religion syllabus, I have been a teacher of Studies of Religion, and a passionate one at that. So while I do not have a Jewish background, I'm very, very interested in Judaism as a depth study, and I'm looking forward to entering into a conversation with you this afternoon about Judaism bioethics. Before we start the presentation, I would like to acknowledge that, although remotely, we are all gathered on Indigenous land. And I pay respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, past, present, and emerging, who are the custodians of the various lands on which we are gathered. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person in the room, and invite you all to walk gently the journey towards reconciliation. So I thought I'd start today with a question. What does it actually mean to be ethical? And perhaps an extension of that question, why would a person choose to behave in an ethical manner? Ponder that for a moment, because this is a broader question than just a question of Judaism and bioethics. Why would a person choose to behave in an ethical manner? In society, lots of people are ethical. Their behaviour reflects a very, very strong series or portfolio of ethical teachings. They may have absolutely no religious affiliation. So what makes our study of this different? Well, when we're looking at the Judaism depth study, we are going to try to work out why would a Jewish person choose to behave in an ethical manner. So the question was then, why are we ethical? Well, we're ethical because we choose to be, and we search for a schema. We search for information. We search for things that are going to assist us to be ethical. And if one is an observant Jew, then that search is going to be found in the precepts of the Jewish religion. So when I teach ethics to students, one of my pet peeves is students that want to go and write about ethical issues, often issues that they're very passionate about. And that's not only in bioethics, it can be in environmental ethics or sexual ethics, depending on what tradition you're doing, or bioethics, and maybe things like stem cells or euthanasia, or all of those things might be things that you're passionate about. But my process for exploring ethics ignores all of those to start with. And in fact, it hones in on the primary reason why anybody who is Jewish would want to behave in an ethical manner. And that's because Jews hold principal beliefs. And as we know from our Year 11 course, the principal beliefs in Judaism are often expressed in three ways. They are expressed in a belief in one God, an omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient God, a God of power, presence, and knowledge, and that same God who created humankind. Principal belief number one. Principal belief number two, that same God who entered into the life of humanity, not only by creating humanity in God's own image, but called humanity into a covenant based on fidelity, a covenant of truth and love, an all-powerful God entering into an agreement with humanity. And the third principal belief, the principal belief of the law, that God intervened in human time to present a codified system of law, both oral law and written law, to Moses on Mount Sinai, as recorded in Exodus. And so because God actually gave that law to Moses, Judaism is known as an ethical monotheism. The law is directly derived from that one God. So if we think about that, that has real implications. If Jews do believe, as they do, in one God who gave a covenant and who established a law, then those things may in fact influence behavior. One of the ways that we can look at how they influence behavior is by asking ourselves the question, why are these beliefs important? Yes, we learnt them off by heart in the preliminary course, but they are important because they provide the bridge between the theoretical, emotional, and psychological understanding of God and the enactment of behavior that is influenced by that God. So to that end, these beliefs are important because Jews tend to attempt to live a moral life, a life according to faithfulness to God. They are duty-bound to do this. They are obligated to do this because God gave the law. And so this isn't a rights-based approach to ethics of I've got rights and I'll do this and I'll do that, but rather this is an obligatory approach, a duty-bound approach in fidelity to God. So how do Jews live that life in fidelity to God? They do it through ethics. And at this point, we need to have a little bit of a look at what ethics is. So ethics is the systematic way that Judaism explains what is the morally acceptable way to behave. Now, there's a couple of words in that sentence that really need to be broken open. Ethics is systematic. It's formed by looking at the way things interact, and it influences individual human behavior. That human behavior is what is deemed to be morally acceptable or not. Ethics and morals are not the same thing. An ethical system of Judaism calls Jews to behave in a certain way. If a Jewish adherent chooses to behave outside that certain way, it does not diminish the ethical system of Judaism. It simply calls into question the moral behavior of the adherent. So thinking about behavior, that's the individual. Thinking about Judaism and ethics, that's the system across the tradition. And also too, interestingly enough, across time. So a couple of other things that are a little hard to perhaps fathom, particularly in the 21st century. And the fact is that ethics is fixed. Sounds like an odd thing to say because time changes everything. But the principles that Jewish ethics are based on are the principles in the Jewish law given to Moses on Mount Sinai. And really, those principles haven't changed. However, the paradox is that ethics is also dynamic, because those timeless principles which were articulated by the sages after the giving of the law, these timeless principles are interpreted and applied to emerging moral dilemmas. And these timeless principles we also call teachings. So think about that for a moment. How is it possible that a principle can be timeless? Well, if you think about perhaps not killing people because the commandment says thou shalt not kill, that is a timeless principle. But when Moses was up on Mount Sinai receiving the law, how many ways were there to kill people? You could certainly stab someone to death. I guess you could strangle them. You might starve them. You might hit them over the head with a rock. It's all very depressing, really. Think about how many ways you can kill someone today. Certainly a recent spate of gun violence in America has been a case in point. There is chemical intervention, there is medical intervention, there is mass assault weapons, nuclear weapons, the list goes on. So the principle of thou shalt not kill remains the same. However, the application of the principle is applied time and time again in each generation as the generations shift and the attitudes change. It's interesting with ethics. Ethics is embedded in everything that an observant Jew thinks and acts upon. You will remember perhaps from your Year 11 course, things like kosher food, for example. It's about the daily ebb and flow for an observant Orthodox Jew. And even for Jews who are less observant, ethical behaviour is often enmeshed in life and not something separate to it because of its duty-bound obligations. So I've given you a few hints, but the next question we need to ask is, where do these principles come from? What, in fact, is the source of Jewish ethical teaching? And again, we go on a tour back to our preliminary course, because Jewish ethical teachings are summarised in halakha, the entire body of Jewish law. Halakha, of course, is recorded in different forms and carries different authorities depending on the expression of Judaism that the adherent belongs to. The sacred writings provide the main source for Jewish teaching or Jewish halakha, and they, of course, are manifest in a variety of ways too. So when we start with Torah, we're starting with the oral law. We're starting with the law given to Moses on Sinai. And in fact, beyond the book of Exodus, all 5 books of the Torah contain 613 mitzvot, the rules that guide Jewish ethical behaviour. And of course, we have the Decalogue, the 10 commandments, as we would know them, that provide explicit ethical advice on a range of issues, including bioethical issues, such as the value of life. But the Torah is not the only place that we find halakha. We find the Tanakh, the other books of the Jewish sacred writings, such as the Nevi'im, the prophets, where prophets such as Micah remind humanity that God asks for acting with justice, loving with tenderness, and walking in humility with God. And perhaps we can apply that to a bioethical issue. Equally well, in the Ketuvim, the texts of the Proverbs often talk sage advice about the behaviour of humanity in the ethical area. And then, of course, there's the codification of the oral law, the Mishnah and the Gemara that resulted in the Talmud. The Talmud is so significant because it's such a collection of different rabbinical interpretations of the same laws and the same texts. And those rabbinical interpretations were critical not only in the 6th century when the Talmud was written, but they're critical today too. And since the Talmud, the tradition of responsa literature and rabbis responding to questions of the law in the area of ethics has been huge. Some of you may study Moses Maimonides, such a famous commentator on halakha. And there are a string of rabbis from the very early days right up to the contemporary rabbis who are making statements about teaching in response to the way ethics operates in the modern world. And I guess the other thing that we need to say there is that there is a range of Jewish understandings, that in fact, not all Jews think the same way, and that's quite critical too. So if we then look at the beliefs, understand why they're important, see how ethics grows and where it comes from, then we can summarize some of a huge sway of ethical principles. And I've only chosen a few that I think might apply to bioethics. There is no exhaustive or correct list. You choose what works best for you. But I think these ones are great. So we know that God is the author of all life. Therefore, all life belongs to God. And if I had to, I could go back to Genesis and I could talk about male and female God creating them in God's own image. We have the overriding obligation to preserve life, which in Judaism is known as pikash nefesh. Again, some sacred text background, sourced often from the book of Leviticus and the book of Deuteronomy, but also commented on many, many times by the sages throughout time. Do not kill is a clear ethical precept in Judaism, and that in its most obvious form comes from the Decalogue from Exodus 20. Rabbis have commented that all human life has infinite value and that aging, illness, and death are a natural part of life. And then another one that we spend a lot of time on in Year 11, which may or may not comfortably apply in bioethics, is the notion of tikkun olam. How does one repair the world? And perhaps one can do that by right relationships and appropriate care in the biomedical sphere of one's neighbours. So that's the underpinning, if you like, the structure that I like to use before even looking at the syllabus or how I might apply this to what's going on in our contemporary world, which is such an important thing for our studies of religion syllabus. Let's break open the syllabus for a moment. Ethics looks so easy. It really does. It asks us to learn about one area of ethics, in our case, bioethics. And then it asks students to learn to both describe and explain Jewish ethical teachings on bioethics. Jewish ethical teachings, not bioethical issues, not bioethical dilemmas, not problems in our society, but describe and explain Jewish ethical teachings in the one area, in our case, bioethics. Let's look at the verbs. Describe. Quite a low order verb, providing the characteristics of bioethical teachings. Well, we've just been through some of those characteristics. We've been through the characteristics that tell us that they are timeless, that they are found in sacred writings, that they are informed by Jewish belief in God. So we've described them. When we come on to explain them, however, what we're going to be doing is making the relationship between things evident. In other words, we're going to explain how it is that a teaching that's 2,000, 3,000 or 4,000 or however many years old can possibly be applied in our modern world, why it's applied, and how it's applied. And most importantly, is it applied differently depending on what expression of Judaism one belongs to? So it's all about the teaching. And so the teaching, if you like, becomes the bridge between the principal beliefs and the sacred texts and the bioethical issues that those teachings are applied to. A couple of other cautionary tales, and I can't stress this enough. It's a pet peeve for me and many other markers. One of the requirements for you in studies of religion is to use appropriate terminology. I think it's outcome H7. Principal, PAL, is an adjective. It means main or most important. And it is the adjective in studies of religion that the syllabus uses to describe beliefs. So if we are talking about principal beliefs, we are talking about the main beliefs of Judaism, and we are talking about it by spelling it PAL. If we are referring to a principle or principles, we're actually talking about a teaching or a philosophy, a way of understanding things. And a teaching is a noun. So if we're describing a principle as ethical, the ethical principle of Pikuash Nefesh, principle is a noun and it's spelt LE. This is so critical. If you use the word incorrectly with the wrong spelling, you're communicating the wrong meaning. And examiners are looking to reward students who really understand the content. So understanding the correct use of terminology is part of that. The other thing that we also need to consider is the other stuff in the syllabus that nobody likes to look at. For example, the outcomes. While it might look easy that what we do in ethics is describe and explain ethical teachings, let's have a look at the rest of the things that the syllabus actually expects us to do that applies equally across all three of our depth studies in each religious tradition. Explaining aspects of religion and belief, including ethics. Describing and analysing the influence of religion on individuals and societies, maybe groups. Describing and analysing, again, that very high order skill, how religious traditions are expressed by their adherents. In this case, how aspects of ethics are expressed. How are they seen in the lives of their adherents? Evaluating the extent to which ethics in Judaism has an influence on the life of adherents. And then finally, it's H8, not H7, applying appropriate terminology and concepts. So having that correct armada of language is really important for this. So it's not as easy as, oh, ethics is only describe and explain, so it's pretty straightforward. We are going to be looking at the effect on adherence. We're going to be looking at the living nature of religion in terms of its impact on society over time. And then finally, my favourite part of the syllabus that I know most students never bother to read. And this is where we get some of the buzzwords from our syllabus. Some of the buzzwords that appear regularly in our HSC questions, as we'll see later. Living religious systems that link directly with the life of adherents. Well, we've already talked a little bit today about that without even mentioning the terminology. But if ethical principles are timeless to the extent that they were first formulated back in the day and hang on to that timelessness and are reapplied, then in fact, they are a living system because they take that historical, very deeply embedded belief and text-based approach, and today they link it with the contemporary issues for adherence. The other pink words there, things like integrated belief system. Oh, belief is so important. Belief is the motivator for all actions of a religious adherent. Belief in God, in whatever form that God is. Enduring questions of human existence, like when does life begin? When does life end? Human existence and enduring questions are really important for ethics, particularly bioethics. And then, of course, the importance of both diversity within and the unity and the underlying of the entire religious tradition, the whole religious tradition. So these apply equally well whether we're doing person school of thought, whether we're doing practice, or whether we're doing ethics. So it's important to put these as a lens over the top of describe and explain ethical teachings when approaching questions. So to review the definition, bioethics then is the systemic reflection, in this case from a Jewish perspective, on issues concerning life and death. This reflection is done through the lens of timeless ethical principles and teachings. From that reflection, guidelines for moral behaviours around these life and death issues are established. Adherents are supported by timeless principles to understand how they might respond to contemporary issues, dilemmas, challenges. And I'm using those words interchangeably to give you the suite of language that you can use in this area. And then finally, nearly 25 minutes into this presentation, and with good reason, what are some of those issues, dilemmas, challenges that might merit our attention? Well, there's a lot of them, but voluntary assisted dying might be one, organ transplant, stem cell usage, abortion, vaccination, possibly even gun violence if you wanted to put a case for it. And in saying all of those, I really want to pay homage to those people who wrote this syllabus in the first place. This syllabus was never meant to be a stagnant, learn the facts out of a textbook by rote. This was the thinking man and woman's RE. And this was designed for you to be able to apply contemporary understandings of these timeless principles to the issues that are most prevalent in our world today. So for bioethics, we ask ourselves, what principles or teachings have developed? What are the sources of the teachings? How do they reflect Jewish belief? And how do different groups within Judaism apply these teachings to those ethical dilemmas or issues in their lives? Okay. I want to talk a little bit now about writing, because as I said to you at the outset, one of the biggest challenges for students in this particular area is wanting to write about the things that they're passionate about, like abortion, euthanasia, whatever it happens to be. And they just want to go out of the box, out of the blocks, and they just want to write about them. Except that if we go back to our syllabus, did our syllabus ever tell us that abortion and euthanasia and things like that were there? No. It wanted an explanation of the teachings. So from my perspective, the best way to think about your writing, obviously you have to answer the question, but as you're crafting your writing and you're crafting your notes, I think the best way to think about it is to start with the ethical teaching or principle. So Jews adhere to the ethical teaching or principle of Pikuach Nefesh, which is the Jewish obligation to preserve life. This teaching has its sources in the sacred writings such as Leviticus, and I'm not going to be able to remember the quote, unfortunately, but I'll get back to it. And it reflects the principal belief of one God, creator of humanity, in God's own image, therefore implying that humanity has this obligation to do anything at all times to save life. This can be applied to the bioethical issue of whichever issue you want, really. That's where you choose. If you do it the other way, this is the risk that you take. The risk is you want to start with your abortion, your vaccination, whatever it is you want to start with. And somehow in an exam, many students flip their lid. They start then saying really odd things like, Jews don't believe in abortion. Well, no, they don't, because the only thing Jews believe in is God. Belief is related to God. So I find that it's actually really challenging to start with an issue, and it's not likely that the question will ask you to. It's more likely that it will start with something around living religious tradition or around teaching or principle. Now, having said that, it's not that it can't be done. Here we have a schema for this. You can start with the issue, and before you even explore it, go to the principle that most Jews would land on to explore it, where that principle comes from by referring to sacred writings, rabbinic responsa, whatever it happens to be, and what principal belief it reflects. Because remember, the first statement I made was, why are Jews ethical? Because they believe in God. So principal belief has to be there somewhere. Okay, anonymous attendee, I'm going to tell you a little bit about remembering these examples. I'm going to give you a little bit of a flowchart actually in a minute, might be helpful to you. Okay. And in fact, not only in a minute, right about now. So this afternoon, as I was finalising my preparation for this presentation, I thought to myself, how would I organise my thinking if I were a Year 12 student today? Keeping in mind that I would want to organise my thinking about really, really contemporary stuff, not old textbook boring stuff. So I thought, using my structure, start with the teaching. I chose Pikash Nefesh, the primacy of human life. I could equally well have chosen do not kill. I could equally have chosen all life belongs to God and there is a duty to preserve it. All of those would have been fine. But I chose Pikash Nefesh. Notice that I have provided two Torah-based sources for where one gets an understanding of where this teaching comes from. While you'll never find the words Pikash Nefesh in the Bible, in the Torah, I should say, on their own, there are verses that communicate this understanding to us. The first one is God creating humanity in God's own image. And the second one is that notion of Leviticus. And this is one that Moses Maimonides quotes. You shall keep my laws and my rules by the pursuit of which man, humanity, might live. So in other words, by keeping law, humanity lives, and living, preserving life, is the primary responsibility. That whole notion of preserving life, again, we ask, why would a Jewish adherent want to do that? Because they believe in God. So what is the principal belief that it reflects? It reflects the principal belief that God is the creator of all life. Because humanity is created in God's image, humanity has the obligation to preserve life. Seems like a really important belief that underpins that teaching, as found in Genesis and Leviticus, and I might say found in hundreds of other places too. So don't just limit yourself. If you've got better quotes, use them by all means. Having established that that is a Jewish ethical teaching, I thought I'd have a go at the issue of vaccination, because I figured, COVID-19 and the world that we're in today, there has certainly been a whole lot of bioethical conversation around this issue. It's become a very, very topical bioethical issue. And as you know, in all societies, not just Jewish society, there have been very divided opinions on vaccinations, and the opinions about vaccination have changed as the pandemic has progressed. Now, if I'd had 6 slides and another half hour, I could have done a bit of a dive into this, but I thought I'd give you just a couple of brief examples to show you a view from orthodoxy and a view from progressive Judaism, and to see how sometimes, even using similar texts, they come up with the same answer, and yet in other bioethical issues, they come up with different answers. So on this vaccination issue, the first view that I sort of interrogated was a view expressed by Rabbi Micah Peltz and 18 of his rabbinic colleagues in New Jersey in America. Rabbi Michael Peltz is the chief rabbi of the progressive temple Beth Shalom in New Jersey. They had a vote at the beginning of 2021 about whether, in fact, Jewish adherents should be immunised. Should they be vaccinated against COVID-19? And in the progressive group of rabbis that Rabbi Micah Peltz works in and represents, it was a unanimous decision, yes. They used a couple of sacred writings there, and this is a really interesting one. It was about the Jewish obligation to look after your own life. So quoting Deuteronomy 4:9, be careful and watch yourselves so that a vaccination would preserve your own health. Alternately, they also sought the corollary of that, which was the obligation to protect the lives of others. And again, chose a quote from Leviticus, this time chapter 19:16, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbour. That's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because they're talking about not killing your neighbour. That's really what Leviticus means in its literal sense. But they're using that particular piece of sacred writing to reinforce this pikash nefesh, that the primacy of my own human life and the life of everybody else is equally sacred. And if Jewish adherents in the progressive expression of Judaism supported that vaccination, then all Jewish adherents would be best protected against the virus. And that was the logic that was used. What I found absolutely fascinating when I went to the ultra-Orthodox view, I sought out the work of the Chabad Lubavitch sect of the Hasidim in Crown Heights in New York. And interestingly enough, when they were talking on their website about the way that they manage this issue, they were talking not so much about the sacred writing, but going back to the Rebbes, the rabbinic voices, the sages of their tradition. And so the Chabad Lubavitch group quoted 2 particular rabbis, one Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he was particularly vocal, I think, early 20th, late 19th century. And his work was around vaccinations for pandemics. One of the pandemics was polio. One of the pandemics was, in fact, the Spanish flu. So various different pandemics. He ruled that if one has a reasonable concern of dangers of not being vaccinated, and that the only day one could be vaccinated is Shabbat, you know, a day where you're not allowed to do anything if you're ultra-Orthodox except go to synagogue, then you could even be vaccinated on Shabbat. So the primacy of vaccination to protect both the individual and the community is something that this Chabad Lubavitch rabbi has been quoted on and applied to the 21st century problem of COVID-19. The other Rebbe that was spoken about in this particular article was Rebbe Schneerson, the last of the big Lubavitch Rebbes, and his work was also very interesting. He spoke about the polio crisis in the 1950s and urged people, if there was even slightest lack of safety, that the safety had to override the lack of safety. And so the Orthodox community in Crown Heights was proudly supporting this notion of vaccination in a similar way to the way the progressive community was, so across the spectrum of Judaism. But they were using different sources to support their arguments. And I found that very interesting, particularly given the communal nature of Judaism and that need to gather. Must have been such a challenge in the pandemic for Jewish people who gather for prayer, need a minyan to pray Kaddish, all of those sorts of things. The everyday life of adherents would have been so impacted that these decisions were made. So I think it's an interesting view on a really contemporary issue. And I'm sure if you searched further, you might even find other information. Now, I don't know that we'll spend much time on this page, but you will certainly get a copy of these slides. They'll be made available to you. And what I did here was I put the headings of the table up the same way, starting with the teaching, moving to the source, expressing the belief, looking at what the contemporary issue is, then the view from one and the view from the other. This is just a whole lot of quotes. And I thought if you wanted to, they're all around voluntary assisted dying, which of course we can call euthanasia, but at the moment, voluntary assisted dying is such an important phrase that it's probably worthwhile using that in your exam to show the examiners that you're really, really familiar with it. Now, obviously, we don't have to use Australian examples, but as you know, voluntary assisted dying has been part of the scene in Australia since 2017 when it was first promulgated in Victoria, and New South Wales has become the final state to approve that. The New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies have had things to say. A rabbi from Western Australia, an Orthodox rabbi by the name of Rabbi Lieberman, had quite a bit to say, and I've got a quote from him there. I thought you might like to have a play with this in your own time if you're interested in the issue of euthanasia and you're looking to apply some ethical teachings to it. Some of this material sorted out in that table might assist you. So basically, I'm going to give you 1 minute just to read the stuff that's there, and then we'll move on. All right. So just to finish up today, I thought we'd have a play in the HSC question sandpit. Always fun. And always a challenge too, I have to say, because there's not too many subjects where you have to know how to use your information to answer a short answer question or an extended response, depending on what the question is. So I've chosen a few questions and I just thought we'd spend a little bit of time breaking them open and thinking about the implications of them in an exam setting. So for example, this is the 2020 HSC question on ethics. Outline 1, ethical teaching in Judaism, and part 2 of that. How does the teaching outlined in A1 guide adherence in living in one of the following areas? Bioethics, enviro, sexual ethics. Obviously, we're doing bioethics. So if we then break that question down, what does it mean for 3 marks to outline an ethical teaching? For 3 marks, you would be expected to identify the teaching. So, percussion of fish, do not kill, all life is sacred because all life belongs to God, all life is of inestimable value, whichever one you want. Find its sources. Have 1 source at least for every teaching. I used to tell my students to have 3, never in a short answer question, but often in an essay. So find at least 1 source that supports that teaching. And then, because you're sketching this broad general outline of this teaching in Judaism, say what principal belief it relates to. So, does it relate to God who gave the law? Does it relate to that notion of ethical monotheism? Does it relate to the notion of God, creator of humanity in God's own image? Whichever one you choose that relates to the teaching. 3 things, 3 marks. Because this is what we call an interdependent question on the HSC, what you have written in part 1A does not need to be repeated in part 1B, or A2, sorry, I should say. You actually step off from there and you answer the second question. So you must use the same teaching that you've used in question first part. And the question asks you, how does the teaching guide adherence? How? How's such a sneaky little word? Because it really means explain. It really means explain. Remember, that's show the connections between. So in other words, what is the connection between the teaching you have identified and the way adherents live their lives? Well, the living of the lives is the issues that they are facing. So the living of the lives is how Orthodox Jewish adherents respond to voluntary assisted dying, how progressive Jewish adherents respond to voluntary assisted dying, how Orthodox Jewish people respond to abortion, how progressive Jewish people respond to abortion. For those 4 marks, you would be expected to choose 1 issue and to do it well, citing 2 different ways that Jews are impacted. So in other words, perhaps the progressive and the Orthodox expression, sometimes even the conservative and the Orthodox expression have variation. Remember that for 4 marks, you only get about 8 to 10 lines. You don't get very much. So we don't want an essay. It's worth 4 marks. If you are really economical, you might be able to show how Orthodox and progressive Jews apply that teaching to 2 issues. You might be able to. I wouldn't advise it. But do not introduce another teaching. Remember, part B, or the second half of this question, is dependent on your answer in part A. So it's a short, sharp, shiny answer, 3 marks for the 3 points you put into the first part, and then 2 marks each for the issue related to the teaching and explored in a couple of expressions. This is another short answer question. It could have been a long answer question, really. I will admit last year when I read the HSC paper, I was a little surprised by it. But it talks about the Judaic tradition being described as dynamic and living. Oh, there's that living religious tradition thing happening. So how, remember how is an explain word, does Judaism, as a dynamic and living tradition, provide ethical guidance to adherents? How? How? What is the connection between the ethical guidance and Judaism? So again, you have to look at that how, and you have to look at that dynamic living tradition, and you have to go back to the notion that these principles or ethical teachings are timeless. They are timeless because they have been there since God gave the law to Moses. But they are dynamic because they are applied in every generation to new ethical dilemmas. Our forefathers did not have to consider stem cell research. They did not have to consider in vitro fertilization. They did not have to consider organ donation. None of those things were relevant, but they are today. So being a dynamic religious tradition, how does the teaching found in the sacred texts, supported by the principal belief, apply in today's world to, I would say, 2 issues, because it's 6 marks. It's 12 lines, 12, 14 lines. So you should be able to do 2 issues. So I guess if we think about that table, if you had a table for each of those teachings and say you had a total of 3 or 4 teachings, each related to 1 or 2 issues, you'd have a very big kit bag that you could choose from. Then the other side of HSC Studies of Religion, of course, is our extended response, our Section 3 response for both our 1 and 2 unit students. This one is the 2019 extended response, and it's one of those very general quotes. The quote from Jeremiah, plans for good and not disaster, giving you a future full of hope. How does Judaism support its adherents to live their lives in a manner that will give them a future full of hope? Well, do you know what? Bioethics is an awesome thing to write about for that essay question. You could, in fact, if you wanted to, write your entire response on bioethics, and you could look at various teachings of bioethics, various sacred texts, various positions where people are given hope through bioethical teaching. Again, perhaps vaccination, perhaps organ donation, perhaps, I don't know, surrogacy, perhaps in vitro fertilization, maybe. So you could, or you could choose one of your ethical teachings and one of your hope-filled ethical issues, and you could write a part of an essay on that. Might even choose 2. But please remember, if the question is a general question and there's no restriction that says you have to talk about a particular part of the syllabus, you are able, if you can make it fit and answer the question, you are able to use any part of your depth study. Do you have to use 3 parts of your depth study? Absolutely not. And don't have anybody tell you that you do. Some of the best answers over the years that I've read in extended response general questions have actually been on one part of the depth study, and they've been blindingly brilliant. Why? Because the student answered the question. In this particular case, this was about giving a future full of hope. So it had to be future focused and it had to be hope focused. That was the kicker in this question. Equally, however, we can be asked totally an essay question, an entire essay question on bioethics, a whole question. So the quote, love your neighbour as yourself. How do the ethical teachings of Judaism guide adherents to be loyal to the commandment to love your neighbour as yourself? In your response, refer to one of the following. Does this question ask you about synagogue services or marriage? Nope. Does it ask you about people or schools of thought? Nope. It just asks you about ethics. And that is absolutely critical. If the question's on ethics, answer it about ethics. And in this particular case, I would be guiding my students to be saying, I think you need a minimum of 3 ethical teachings. I think you need a minimum of 6 supporting pieces of evidence from the scripture to underpin those. And I think you need 3 issues that you're going to apply those to across at least 2 expressions of Judaism. So when you're preparing your notes, think about that equation. 3 teachings supported by at least 6 sources, supported by 1 principal belief, supporting each teaching supporting 1 area or 1 issue of ethics across 2 expressions of Judaism. And that to me seems like a really logical way to chunk down your notes. Just in finishing up today, I found a couple of quotes. This is one of my favorite quotes. Chaya Greenberger is actually a journalist in America. And she says, Judaism is based on a divinely ordained but humanly interpreted blueprint for moral life in all realms. Jewish bioethics nests within this blueprint. The God-given biblical scriptures, along with their exegetic guidelines and a core of oral teachings, form the basis for a continuously growing corpus of Jewish philosophy and halakha. In theory, all Judaic ethics stem from the words accepted to be either divinely given or inspired. In practice, it's really, really complicated. And it is. And I know I've only touched the surface today in exploring some of these issues. But in trying to ask you to think about them, I'm hoping that I've given you a way that you can think about your work as you put it together. And my final set of quotes, Goslin, Rosenberg and Gordon, a group of 3 American Jewish writers from fairly early in the 21st century, were quoted as saying, to traditional-minded Jews, Jewish bioethics is a subset of halakha, which guides all of their activities. To more secular Jews, seeking guidance in difficult decisions about their health, Jewish bioethics offers helpful lessons and considered opinions from the sages. Summed up so beautifully by Rabbi Jackie Ninio, who says, in progressive Judaism, halakha, Jewish law, has vote, not veto. So the more orthodox one becomes, the more immutable and applicable halakha is, the more progressive one moves towards. The advice of halakha is sage, but may not be the final determining factor. So thank you for being here today. I hope that's been helpful. And I wish you all the best with your studies of Judaism and your revision on bioethics for your trial and ultimately your HSC. Thanks for joining us.